The world called Julien and Clara the Pulse. They didn't just finish each other's sentences. They seemed to share a single nervous system. In their 10 years of marriage, they had never spent a night apart, never had a hobby the other didn't share. They believed this was the ultimate form of love, a total, sacrificial blurring of boundaries. They were wrong. They were wrong. They were actually starving each other to death in a slow motion, emotional famine. The twist began when they checked into the solarium, a high-concept relationship sanctuary nestled in a remote desert. The facility used bioadaptive architecture to mirror their bond's health. On their first night, the walls began to turn a sickly, bruised purple. The air grew thin. Julien and Clara sat on the sofa, clutching each other's hands, knuckles white. "We're so happy, aren't we?" Clara whispered, eyes sunken, skin like parchment. "Perfect," Julien replied, his voice a dry rasp. Suddenly, the floor beneath them vibrated. A voice, cool and synthesized, filled the room. "Critical system error. Redundancy detected. The individual has ceased to exist. Initiating the severance protocol to prevent total psychological collapse." The room didn't just split. It fractured. A wall of obsidian black glass slammed down between them, inches from their interlaced fingers. Julien screamed, throwing himself against the glass. On the other side, Clara was hysterical, her silent wails fogging the surface. They were in identical rooms, but they were utterly alone for the first time in a decade. The dramatic twist: the doors wouldn't unlock until each of them achieved a baseline of self-actualization. The house was monitoring their vitals, but it wasn't looking for love. It was looking for autonomy. The screen on Julien's wall flashed a single directive: feel yourself. The screen on Clara's wall flashed: remember your name. For the first 48 hours, they withered. Julien realized he didn't know what he liked to eat when Clara wasn't picking the menu. Clara realized she didn't know what she thought about politics, art, or even the weather without Julien's opinion to calibrate against. They were ghosts. Without the other two haunt, they were disappearing. Then, the self-care requirements became physical. To get water, Julien had to spend an hour in a sensory deprivation tank, forced to listen to nothing but his own heartbeat. To get food, Clara had to complete a series of complex puzzles that required her to prioritize her own logic over what Julien would think. It was a brutal, twisted form of therapy. They were being forced to care for their own bodies and minds as if they were precious strangers. Julien discovered he loved the silence. He started to draw something he'd given up because Clara didn't enjoy it. Clara discovered he was a creature of movement. She danced in the empty room until she was breathless, finding a strength in her limbs she'd forgotten existed. As they began to practice radical self-care, nourishing their own spirits, setting their own rhythms, and reclaiming their individual identities, the bruised purple walls began to turn a vibrant, healthy gold. The glass wall didn't shatter. It simply dissolved. Julien and Clara stood across the room from each other. They didn't run to embrace. They stood still, assessing. They looked different. Their posture was upright. Their eyes were clear, and they carried an aura of solidness that hadn't been there before. "I like the color blue," Julien said, his voice resonant and sure. "And I need 2 hours of silence every morning." Clara smiled, a real, sharp smile that reached her eyes. "I'm going to travel on my own for a month every year, and I'm never going to ask permission to feel tired again." The pulse was gone. In its place were two distinct, powerful heartbeats. They left the solarium not as a unit, but as partners. The happy ending wasn't that they went back to how they were. It was that they never would. They learned that a relationship isn't a 1 + 1 = 1 foot equation. That leads to 0. They learned that 1 + 1 = 2 is the only way to build something that lasts. By taking care of themselves, by guarding their own joy, and maintaining their own self-care rituals. They finally had something real to give to the other. They weren't leaning on each other like two collapsing towers anymore. They were two pillars, standing separate, holding up a shared roof that was finally, truly stable. They lived happily and individually ever after. together. If you liked this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Bye. See you next time.